They all ignored her, until she saved everything no one saw coming. The poor maid nobody believed became the unstoppable hero. How did she pull off the impossible? Welcome back, my amazing family and friends. If you're ready to dive into this unforgettable story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Tomorrow, I'll bring you another incredible tale you absolutely can't miss. Let's get started, and don't forget to like and share to help our community grow. The September sun hadn't yet burned through the morning fog when Yanelle Morrison pushed through the servants' entrance of the Winchester estate, her third-hand sneakers squeaking against the imported Italian tile. She was 43 but felt 70, her back a constant reminder of 20 years spent scrubbing other people's floors, washing other people's sheets, raising other people's children while her own daughter grew up in her sister's care 3 towns over. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee she wasn't allowed to drink. Mr. Winchester kept a specific blend that cost more per pound than Yanelle made in a week. She tied her faded blue apron around her waist, the fabric thin from 1,000 washes, and began her morning routine with the mechanical precision of someone who'd long stopped expecting anything to change. "You're late." The voice cut through the kitchen's quiet like a blade. Yanelle didn't need to turn around to know it was Carolyn Winchester, the lady of the house, draped in a silk robe that probably cost more than Yanelle's car. She wasn't late, she was exactly on time, arriving at 5:30 a.m. as she had every weekday for the past 8 years. But correcting Mrs. Winchester would mean risking the job that kept Yanelle's daughter in community college, kept the lights on in her cramped studio apartment, kept food on a table that never had guests. Yes. Sorry. The words came automatically, smooth and empty as the politeness rich people demanded from those they paid to be invisible. Carolyn's eyes, pale blue, cold as lake ice, swept over Yanelle with the assessment of someone examining a tool for defects. The guest rooms need to be perfect. My husband is hosting donors for his Senate campaign this weekend. Important people. I trust you understand what that means. Yes. And Yanelle. Carolyn paused at the kitchen doorway, her French manicure tapping against the frame. Try to stay out of sight when the guests arrive. You know how it is. You know how it is. Code 4. Your black face makes wealthy white donors uncomfortable. Yanelle had heard variations of this her entire working life. She nodded, swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth, and watched Carolyn glide away, leaving behind the cloying scent of perfume that cost more than Yanelle's monthly rent. The Winchester estate sprawled across 12 acres of prime Connecticut real estate, a monument to old money and older prejudices. Richard Winchester III, always the third, as if the Roman numeral added legitimacy to his inherited wealth, was in his second term as state senator and eyeing a congressional seat. His campaign posters showed a man in his early 50s with silver-threaded hair and a smile calculated to inspire trust. Winchester for Congress, tradition, values, leadership. Yanelle had worked for the Winchesters long enough to know the difference between the public image and the private reality. She'd cleaned up after their fights, scrubbed wine stains from carpets thrown during arguments about affairs and spending. She'd seen Richard stumble in at 3 a.m. smelling of scotch and someone else's perfume. She'd watched Carolyn pop pills from unmarked bottles, her hand shaking as she demanded the house be spotless for parties where she'd pretend everything was perfect. But none of that was Yanelle's business. She was the help. Invisible. Disposable. She started in the guest wing, stripping beds with practiced efficiency. The sheets were Egyptian cotton, thread count so high they felt like water in her hands. Yanelle's own sheets were discount polyester from a big box store, scratchy and thin, but they were clean and they were hers. She'd learned long ago not to covet what she couldn't have, to find pride in the small space of her life even if others looked down on it. The first guest room overlooked the estate's gardens, where a landscaping crew was already at work, shaping hedges into geometric perfection. Yanelle paused at the window, watching them labor under the climbing sun. Most of them were Latino men who probably faced the same casual contempt she did, reduced to their function, stripped of their humanity by people who'd never had to work a day in their privileged lives. Yanelle. Where are my cufflinks? Richard Winchester's voice boomed from the master suite. Yanelle abandoned the half-made bed and hurried down the hall, her pulse quickening with the familiar anxiety of never knowing what mood she'd find him in. Some days he barely acknowledged her existence. Other days he seemed to take pleasure in pointing out every minor flaw in her work, his criticism delivered with a smile that never reached his eyes. She found him in his dressing room, already dressed in suit pants and an undershirt, his face flushed with irritation. The room smelled of expensive cologne and the particular musk of male entitlement. The gold ones with the Winchester family crest, he said, not looking at her. Carolyn must have moved them. Yanel knew exactly where they were, in the second drawer where they'd been for 8 years, where Mrs. Winchester had never touched them because Carolyn Winchester didn't concern herself with her husband's accessories. But saying so would imply Richard didn't know his own belongings, and implying a Winchester was wrong about anything was a firing offense. She moved to the dresser and retrieved the cufflinks, holding them out in her palm like an offering. Richard took them without acknowledgement, his fingers brushing her hand for a fraction of a second before jerking away, as if her skin might contaminate him. The caterers will be here at 4. Make sure they use the service entrance. I don't want them traipsing through the main house. Yes, sir. And Yanel. He met her eyes for the first time, his gaze sharp with warning. This weekend is crucial. No mistakes. Understood. Understood, sir. She left before he could find something else to criticize, her chest tight with a rage she could never express. 20 years of swallowing anger, of smiling through disrespect, of accepting crumbs and calling it a living. Sometimes, in her darkest moments, Yanel wondered what her life might have looked like if she'd been born with different skin, different circumstances, different luck. But those thoughts led nowhere productive, so she pushed them down and returned to making beds that would cradle the dreams of people who'd never spare a thought for who cleaned their sheets. The day blurred into the familiar rhythm of invisible labor. Yanel scrubbed bathrooms until the fixtures gleamed, vacuumed carpets until no trace of footprints remained, polished silver until she could see her distorted reflection in spoons and serving platters. She worked through lunch, a protein bar eaten standing up in the kitchen while Carolyn picked at a salad that cost $40 from some trendy organic delivery service. By 3 o'clock, Yanel's back was screaming and her feet throbbed in her cheap sneakers. She was refilling the guest bathroom's amenities, soaps and lotions in little bottles that guests would barely use before they were thrown away, when she heard the first unusual sound. A thump from somewhere in the house. Heavy. Deliberate. Yanel froze, listening. The Winchester estate was usually quiet during the day, the silence broken only by Carolyn's phone calls or Richard's occasional outbursts. But this sound was different. Foreign. Another thump. Then voices, low and urgent. Yanel set down the basket of toiletries and moved toward the hallway, her instinct screaming that something was wrong. She'd worked in this house long enough to know its sounds, its rhythms, the normal pattern of its daily life. This wasn't normal. The voices were coming from Richard's study, a room Yanel rarely entered. She approached carefully, her soft-soled shoes silent on the hardwood floor. The study door was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see movement, figures that didn't belong. 3 men in dark clothes. Not caterers. Not staff. They moved with purpose, rifling through Richard's desk, pulling books from shelves, searching for something. Yanel's breath caught. Burglars? In broad daylight? But even as the thought formed, she realized these weren't random criminals. They were too organized, too focused. And one of them was holding a gun. Her mind raced. Call 911? But her phone was in her purse in the servants' quarters. Run. But Carolyn was somewhere in the house, probably unaware of the danger. For all her faults, for all the casual cruelty and dismissive contempt, Carolyn Winchester didn't deserve to be hurt by armed intruders. Yanel made her decision in a heartbeat, driven by an instinct she didn't fully understand, the same instinct that had kept her daughter safe, that had gotten her through 20 years of degradation with her dignity bruised but intact, that whispered she was more than what they saw when they looked at her. She stepped away from the door, moving quickly and silently back toward the main staircase. If she could get to Carolyn, warn her, get them both out of the house. Going somewhere. The voice came from behind her, cold and amused. Yanel spun to find a 4th man blocking the hallway, his face partially obscured by a dark baseball cap. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his hand rested casually on the gun at his hip. This was the moment that would change everything. The moment when the invisible woman would have to decide, stay silent and survive, or step forward and fight. Yanel looked into the man's eyes and saw something that finally broke through her trained submission, not fear for herself, but a blazing clarity about what she represented. Every maid who'd ever been ignored. Every worker who'd ever been dismissed. Every black woman who'd ever been told to stay in her place. She opened her mouth to scream a warning, to shatter the silence she'd maintained for so long, to finally be seen. What would you do if you had to choose between staying safe in invisibility or stepping into danger to save someone who never saw you as human? Drop your thoughts below. The scream died in Yanel's throat as the man's hand clamped over her mouth, rough and unyielding. He moved with practiced efficiency, spinning her around and pinning her against the wall with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs. The wallpaper, hand-painted silk from Paris that cost more per square foot than Yanel's monthly salary, pressed cold against her cheek. "Not a sound," he hissed in her ear. "You understand me?" Yanel nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. Up close, she could smell him, cigarettes and cheap aftershave and something metallic that might have been gun oil. This wasn't some desperate junkie looking for jewelry to pawn. This was planned. Professional. He pulled her away from the wall, keeping one hand locked on her arm, and marched her toward the study. Yanel's mind spun through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Where was Carolyn? Had they already found her? And what were they looking for in Richard's study? The study was chaos. Books pulled from shelves, desk drawers yanked open, papers scattered across the Persian rug like autumn leaves. The three men she'd seen earlier looked up as she was pushed through the doorway, their faces registering brief interest before dismissing her. Just the maid. Nobody important. Found her snooping in the hallway, her captor said, shoving Yanel toward an antique chair in the corner. What do you want me to do with her? The man who appeared to be the leader, older, with a scar running through his left eyebrow, barely glanced at Yanel. Tie her up. We're almost done here. Maybe she knows where it is, another man suggested. He was younger, nervous energy radiating from him like heat. The help sees everything, right? The leader's eyes shifted to Yanel with new interest. You work here. Yanel's mouth was dry as sand, but she managed to nod. Every instinct screamed at her to stay quiet, to be invisible like she'd been trained to be. But a different voice, one she'd been suppressing for 20 years, whispered that invisibility wouldn't save her now. How long? The leader asked. 8 years. Her voice came out stronger than she expected. Then you know the house. You know where Senator Winchester keeps his private documents. The ones he doesn't want anyone to see. Yanel's mind raced. She did know Richard's habits, his hiding places. She'd cleaned his study hundreds of times, had seen the false bottom in his desk drawer, the safe hidden behind the portrait of his grandfather. She'd never looked at the contents. That would have meant acknowledging she had curiosity, agency, the right to know things. The help didn't ask questions. But these men weren't asking for state secrets or campaign documents. The way they searched, the urgency in their movements, they were looking for something specific. Something damaging. I don't know anything about his private documents, Yanel said carefully. I just clean. The leader studied her with the cold assessment of a man deciding if she was worth keeping alive. That's unfortunate. Because we have a problem. We were told Winchester keeps insurance on his business partners, evidence of their deals, recordings, documents. We need to find it before his donors arrive tonight. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't a robbery. This was corporate espionage, or blackmail, or something worse. And these men were willing to tear the house apart, and hurt anyone in their way, to find what they came for. Check upstairs, the leader ordered. If it's not in the study, it's in his bedroom safe. Two of the men moved toward the door. That's when Yanel heard it, the soft click of heels on hardwood, coming from the direction of the main stairs. Carolyn, probably wondering why the house was so quiet, probably coming to find Yanel to complain about something trivial. Carolyn, walking straight into danger. Someone's coming, the nervous one hissed. The leader's hand went to his gun. Handle it. Time crystallized into sharp, bright clarity. Yanel saw what was about to happen, saw Carolyn appearing in the doorway, saw the men's guns rising, saw blood on expensive tile and another black woman blamed for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because that's what would happen. When the police came, when the story was told, Yanel would be the suspect. The help with a grudge. The angry black woman who let criminals into the house, who stood by while her employer was hurt. Unless she acted first. Wait, Yanel said, her voice cutting through the tension. I know where the safe is. The real one. The leader's hand paused on his weapon. You said you didn't know. I lied. Yanel met his eyes, forcing confidence she didn't feel into her voice. You're right, the help sees everything. I know exactly where Senator Winchester keeps his insurance. But if you hurt anyone in this house, you'll never get it. It was a bluff built on 20 years of observation, of being invisible while the Winchesters lived their lives around her as if she didn't exist. She'd seen Richard hide things, had noticed his patterns. She didn't know if there really was a hidden safe with damaging documents, but these men believed there was, and belief was all she needed to buy time. The footsteps in the hall grew closer. "Show me," the leader said. "Now." "Not until you let Mrs. Winchester leave the house safely. She doesn't know anything. Let her go, and I'll take you to the safe." The nervous one laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "The maid's negotiating? That's rich." But the leader was smarter. He saw what Yanel was offering: a clean exit, no violence, no complications. Just the information they came for and a quick disappearance. "How do I know you're not lying?" he asked. "Because I want to survive this," Yanel said simply. "And because I know Richard Winchester better than anyone in this house. I've cleaned up his secrets for 8 years. I know where he hides things." Carolyn's voice drifted from the hallway. "Yanel? Where are you? The caterers just called." She appeared in the study doorway, her sentence dying as she registered the scene. 4 armed men. Papers everywhere. And Yanel, standing in the center of it all, no longer invisible. Carolyn's face drained of color. Her mouth opened to scream. "Mrs. Winchester," Yanel said quickly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "These men are looking for your husband's documents. I'm going to help them find what they need, and then they're going to leave. But I need you to go upstairs, lock yourself in your bedroom, and call 911 in exactly 10 minutes. Can you do that?" It was the first time in 8 years that Yanel had given Carolyn Winchester a direct instruction. The first time she'd spoken to her employer as an equal rather than a subordinate. The shift in dynamic was so sudden, so unexpected, that Carolyn simply stared at her. "Mrs. Winchester," Yanel repeated, her voice harder now. "Go. Now." Perhaps it was the authority in Yanel's voice, or the recognition that the maid who'd been invisible for so long was suddenly the only thing standing between Carolyn and the armed men. Whatever the reason, Carolyn stumbled backward, nodded once, and fled toward the stairs. The nervous one moved to follow her. "She'll call the cops." "Let her go," the leader said, his eyes never leaving Yanel's face. "We'll be gone in 10 minutes. Show me the safe." Yanel's gamble had worked. She'd bought Carolyn time to escape, time to call for help. But now she had to deliver on her promise, and she had no idea if the safe she suspected existed actually contained what these men were looking for. She led them out of the study and down the hallway toward Richard's private den, a room even Carolyn rarely entered, a masculine sanctuary of leather and dark wood where the senator conducted his most confidential business. Yanel had cleaned it once a week for 8 years, had vacuumed around the desk where Richard made his deals, had polished the bar where he poured drinks for men who spoke in careful euphemisms about campaign contributions and favors owed. And she'd noticed, over the years, that one section of the bookshelf sounded hollow when she dusted it. The den smelled of cigars and old money. Yanel moved to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of leather-bound first editions that Richard had probably never read. She found the section that had always seemed wrong, too perfect, too uniform. "Here," she said, pressing against the panel. Nothing happened. The nervous one laughed again, reaching for his gun. "She's playing us." Yanel pressed harder, searching for a mechanism. Her fingers found a slight depression in the wood, and she pushed. The panel clicked and swung inward, revealing a small safe set into the wall. The leader smiled, thin and cold. Well. The maid does know her employer's secrets. Open it." "I don't know the combination." "Then you're no longer useful." His hand moved toward his gun, and Yanel felt time slow down again. She had seconds to think, to remember, to piece together 8 years of observation into something that might save her life. Richard Winchester was a creature of habit and ego. His passwords were always variations of his name, his birth date, his family history. The combination would be the same, something meaningful to him, something obvious if you'd spent years watching him, invisible in his peripheral vision. "Try the 15th of October 1969, Yanel said. "His birth date." The leader worked the combination. The safe stayed locked. His father's birth date. The 22nd of March 1940. Still locked. Sweat beaded on Yanel's forehead. One more wrong guess and these men would cut their losses. She thought about Richard, about his endless speeches about tradition and family legacy, about the portrait of his grandfather that hung in every office, every room, the man who'd built the Winchester fortune on railroad money and political connections. "Try 18 to 76, she said. The year his great-grandfather founded Winchester Industries. The leader spun the dial. Clicked through the numbers. The safe opened. Inside was a small external hard drive and a manila folder thick with documents. The leader pulled them out, his smile widening as he flipped through pages that Yanel couldn't see but could imagine. Proof of bribes, evidence of deals that would end Richard Winchester's political career and possibly put him in prison. Good girl, the leader said, pocketing the hard drive. You just saved your life. And hers, Yanel added. You said you'd leave without hurting anyone. We're men of our word. He gestured to his crew. Let's move. They filed out of the den, leaving Yanel standing alone beside the empty safe. She waited until she heard the servant's entrance slam shut, waited until the sound of an engine faded down the driveway. Then her legs gave out and she sank onto Richard's leather chair, her whole body shaking with delayed fear and adrenaline. She'd done it. She'd saved Carolyn. She'd outsmarted armed criminals using nothing but 20 years of careful observation. She'd stopped being invisible and survived. But as sirens wailed in the distance, Carolyn must have called 911 early. Yanel realized her real problems were just beginning. Because now she'd have to explain to the police, to Richard Winchester, to everyone, how the maid knew about the hidden safe. How she knew the combination. What other secrets she might have seen in 8 years of being treated like furniture. She'd stepped out of invisibility, and there was no going back. The police arrived in a storm of flashing lights and barked commands. 6 officers, 2 detectives, and enough aggressive questioning to make Yanel feel like the criminal instead of the witness. They found her still sitting in Richard's den, her hands clasped in her lap to stop them from shaking, her mind racing through everything she'd just survived. Detective Harrison was the older one, grey-haired, thick around the middle, with eyes that had seen too much to trust anyone easily. His partner, Detective Moore, was younger, black, and watched Yanel with an expression she couldn't quite read. Suspicion? Sympathy? Both? Let me get this straight, Harrison said, for the 3rd time. 4 armed men broke into the Winchester estate, and instead of hiding or running, you negotiated with them. I didn't have a choice, Yanel said. Mrs. Winchester was about to walk into the room. They would have hurt her. And how exactly did you know where Senator Winchester's hidden safe was located? There it was. The question she'd been dreading. Because the truth, that she'd spent 8 years being invisible enough to notice everything, sounded suspicious. It made her look like she'd been casing the house, planning something, waiting for an opportunity. I clean that room every week, Yanel said carefully. I noticed the bookshelf sounded hollow. It's my job to pay attention to details. Your job is to dust and vacuum, Harrison said. Not to memorize the senator's private security measures. Detective. Moore's voice cut through his partner's interrogation. Ms. Morrison protected Mrs. Winchester and prevented a potentially violent confrontation. Maybe we should be thanking her instead of treating her like a suspect. Harrison's jaw tightened, but he stepped back. Moore leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. Can you describe the men again? Any identifying features, accents, anything that might help us find them? Yanel closed her eyes, pulling up the memory. The leader had a scar through his left eyebrow. The nervous one had a tattoo on his wrist. Looked like numbers, maybe a date. They were professional. This wasn't random. They came for something specific, Moore said. The hard drive and documents from the safe. Any idea what might have been on them? Yanel shook her head. She had suspicions. 8 years of cleaning up after Richard Winchester's private meetings left little room for innocence, but speculation wasn't her job. The help didn't have opinions about their employer's business dealings. Except she wasn't just the help anymore. Not after today. Where's Mrs. Winchester? Yanel asked. Being checked by paramedics, Moore said. She's shaken but unharmed. Thanks to you. The words should have felt like validation, but they settled in Yanel's chest with uncomfortable weight. She'd saved Carolyn Winchester, the woman who'd spent 8 years treating her like an inconvenient appliance. And now what? A thank you card? A small bonus? Or would everything go back to normal, her moment of heroism forgotten as quickly as it happened? The front door slammed open with enough force to rattle the chandelier in the foyer. Richard Winchester stormed in like a hurricane, his face red with fury, his usually perfect hair disheveled. A young woman in an expensive pantsuit hurried behind him, probably his campaign manager, damage control already in motion. Where is it? Richard demanded, pushing past the officers toward his den. Where's my safe? Sir, this is an active crime scene, Harrison started. I don't give a damn about your crime scene. They took my property. Richard's eyes landed on Yanel, still sitting in his chair, and his expression twisted into something ugly. What did you tell them? Yanel stood slowly, drawing herself up to her full height. For 8 years she'd made herself small in this man's presence, had hunched her shoulders and lowered her eyes and apologized for existing. But she just faced down 4 armed men. Richard Winchester's rage didn't scare her anymore. I told them where the safe was, she said evenly. To save your wife's life. You had no right to give them access to my private documents. Do you have any idea what you've done? I saved Mrs. Winchester from potentially getting shot, Yanel said, her voice harder now. You're welcome. The room went silent. Officers exchanged glances. Moore's lips twitched with what might have been approval. Richard's face darkened to an alarming shade of purple. You're fired, he said. Effective immediately. I want you out of this house in 10 minutes. Richard. Carolyn's voice came from the doorway, weak but firm. She looked pale, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders despite the warm September afternoon. She saved my life. You can't fire her. She compromised our security. She had no authorization to. She saved my life, Carolyn repeated, stronger now. If she hadn't been here, if she hadn't acted, those men would have. Her voice broke. For the first time since Yanel had known her, Carolyn Winchester looked fragile. Human. Richard's jaw worked, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Yanel could see the calculation in his eyes, the political optics of firing the maid who'd saved his wife, especially a black maid, especially with cameras probably already gathering outside. His campaign was built on family values and community service. Firing a hero didn't play well. We'll discuss this later, he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Detective, I need to know what was taken. Immediately. Harrison and Richard disappeared into the den, their voices rising in argument. Moore approached Yanel, his expression sympathetic. You'll need to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement, he said quietly. And Ms. Morrison? Be careful. Winchester is going to want someone to blame for this, and you're an easy target. Yanel nodded, understanding the warning. She'd lived her whole life knowing how easily black women became scapegoats, how quickly heroism could be rewritten as suspicion. But as she gathered her purse and headed toward the servants' entrance, because even now, even after everything, she knew better than to leave through the front door, Carolyn intercepted her. Yanel, wait. Yanel turned, surprised. Carolyn Winchester had never said her name with anything approaching warmth before. Thank you, Carolyn said simply. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. If you hadn't. She trailed off, seeming to really look at Yanel for the first time in 8 years. I've never properly appreciated you. I'm sorry for that. The apology hung in the air between them, insufficient and yet somehow monumental. 8 years of casual cruelty couldn't be erased with 2 words, but Yanel recognized the effort it took for Carolyn to offer them. You're welcome, Mrs. Winchester, Yanel said. I hope you feel better. She left before the moment could become more awkward, walking out of the Winchester estate with her head high and her uniform still on. She didn't know if she still had a job. She didn't know what Richard would tell the police, what stories he might spin to protect himself. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was done being invisible. The story broke on the evening news before Yanel even made it home. She sat in her 15-year-old Honda Civic in a grocery store parking lot, watching her phone explode with notifications as the media frenzy began. Breaking news: armed robbery at Winchester Estate. Maid saves senator's wife from home invasion. Hero or accomplice? Questions surround Winchester break-in. That last headline made Yanel's stomach drop. Already the narrative was shifting, the questions beginning. How did the criminals know about the hidden safe? How did they get past the estate security? And how convenient that the maid was there to save Mrs. Winchester, or was she part of the plan all along? Her phone rang. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail, then listened as a reporter's eager voice asked for an exclusive interview. We want to tell your side of the story, Ms. Morrison. The public has a right to know the truth. The truth. As if truth mattered when reputation and power were at stake. Yanel drove home in a daze, her mind spinning through possibilities. She should feel proud. She'd saved someone's life today, had stood up to armed criminals, had finally stepped out of the shadow of servitude. Instead, she felt the weight of impending consequences. Richard Winchester was one of the most powerful men in Connecticut. If he decided Yanel was a liability, what chance did a poor black maid have against his lawyers, his connections, his ability to shape narratives? Her apartment felt smaller than usual when she finally trudged up 3 flights of stairs, her back screaming with every step. The studio was clean but worn, furnished with second-hand finds and discount store specials. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors' television, their arguments, their lives bleeding through the drywall. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She'd earned every inch of it with 20 years of hard labor. She collapsed onto her sagging couch and finally let herself feel the day. The terror, the adrenaline, the strange exhilaration of being seen. Her hands were still shaking. She pressed them together, prayer-like, and tried to steady her breathing. Her phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed her daughter's number. Mom? Mom, are you okay? I just saw the news. They're saying you were in a robbery. Are you hurt? Keisha's voice, high with panic, cracked something open in Yanel's chest. Her daughter. Her reason for enduring 20 years of degradation and disrespect. Keisha was in her second year at community college, studying nursing, trying to build a life better than the one Yanel had lived. I'm fine, baby. I'm okay. It was scary, but I'm safe. They're saying terrible things, Mom. Online, people are. Keisha's voice dropped to a whisper. Some people are calling you a hero, but others are saying you were involved, that you helped the robbers. Why would they say that? Because that's what they always do, Yanel thought. When black women rise above their assigned place, they're either saints or criminals. No room for the messy, complicated truth in between. Don't read the comments, Keisha. Just know that I did what I had to do to keep someone safe. That's all that matters. They talked for a few more minutes, Keisha's worry gradually easing as Yanel assured her everything would be fine. But after they hung up, Yanel stared at her phone, watching the headlines multiply, and wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. She'd saved Carolyn Winchester. But who would save her from what came next? The next morning, Yanel woke to 3 things: a stiff neck from falling asleep on the couch, 17 missed calls, and a text message from an unknown number that made her blood run cold. We know what you saw. Stay quiet, or you'll regret becoming a hero. Yanel's hands trembled as she read the text message again, each word burning into her consciousness like acid. We know what you saw. Stay quiet, or you'll regret becoming a hero. The criminals from yesterday. They had her number. They knew who she was. And they were warning her, or threatening her, to keep silent about something. But what had she seen? The safe? The documents? Or something else she hadn't even realized was significant? She took a screenshot of the message, her mind racing through options. Call the police? But Detective Harrison already looked at her with suspicion. This message could be twisted into evidence of her involvement, proof that she was communicating with the criminals. Tell Richard Winchester? The man who tried to fire her yesterday would probably use this as ammunition to paint her as an accomplice. She was alone in this. Just like she'd been alone her entire life. Yanel got ready for work mechanically, her body moving through the familiar routine while her mind spun. She didn't know if she still had a job at the Winchester estate, but she needed to act normal, to not give anyone, criminals or cops, reason to think she was anything other than what she'd always been. The help. Invisible. Harmless. Except she wasn't invisible anymore, and that was the problem. The Winchester estate looked different in the harsh morning light. Police tape still cordoned off sections of the property, and a patrol car sat in the circular driveway, protection for the Winchesters, or surveillance on the crime scene. Yanel parked in her usual spot near the servants' entrance and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. Her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her hit the green button. Ms. Morrison. A woman's voice, crisp and professional. This is Rebecca Torres from the Connecticut Post. I'd like to interview you about yesterday's incident. We're running a feature on everyday heroes, and your story. No comment, Yanel said, and hung up. The phone immediately rang again. Different number. She turned it off completely. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. No Carolyn barking orders. No Richard's booming voice on conference calls. Yanel found Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, a stern British woman who'd always treated Yanel with cool professionalism, in the kitchen, preparing breakfast trays. "You're still here," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone unreadable. "Should I not be? Senator Winchester wanted you terminated. Mrs. Winchester insisted you stay. They argued about it for an hour last night." Mrs. Henderson set down a silver coffee pot with more force than necessary. "You've made things complicated, Yanel. This house doesn't do well with complications. I saved Mrs. Winchester's life. Yes, and now everyone's asking how the maid knew about hidden safes and security codes. The police, the media, the senator's political opponents, they're all circling like sharks. Your heroism has become a liability." The words stung because they were true. Yanel had hoped that saving Carolyn might finally earn her some respect, some recognition as more than just the help. Instead, she'd painted a target on her back. "What should I do?" The question came out smaller than Yanel intended. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. "Keep your head down. Do your work. And for God's sake, don't talk to any reporters. The senator's campaign team is working on damage control, and they don't need you complicating the narrative." Complicating the narrative. Code 4, stay invisible again. Pretend yesterday never happened. Go back to being the silent black maid who knew her place. Yanel nodded and picked up her cleaning supplies, even though her hand still shook, even though the threatening text message burned in her memory like a brand. She started in the guest rooms, stripping beds that would never be used now that the donor event was cancelled. As she worked, she couldn't stop thinking about what the criminals had stolen. The hard drive. The documents. Richard Winchester's insurance on his business partners. What if those documents contained more than just business dealings? What if they implicated other people, powerful people, in illegal activities? People who would want to ensure that anyone who'd seen inside that safe, anyone who could testify about its contents, stayed permanently silent? The realization hit her like ice water. She wasn't just a witness to a robbery. She was a potential threat to whoever was named in those documents. The text message wasn't about keeping quiet about the criminals' identities. It was about not revealing what might have been in Richard Winchester's blackmail collection. And if Richard had been keeping insurance on dangerous people, how long before those same people decided that eliminating loose ends was worth the risk? Yanel's hands stilled on the half-made bed. She needed help. Real help. But who could she trust? The police saw her as suspicious. The Winchesters saw her as a problem. The criminals saw her as a threat. She was expendable from every angle. Yanel. She spun to find Detective Moore standing in the doorway, his badge clipped to his belt, his expression serious. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Detective. I didn't hear you come in." "Mrs. Henderson let me in. I need to ask you a few more questions." He stepped into the room, and Yanel noticed he positioned himself between her and the door. Not aggressive, but deliberate. "Yesterday, when you opened the safe, did you see what was inside? Read any of the documents?" "No." The leader took everything immediately. "But you must have seen something. Even a glimpse." Yanel thought about lying, about claiming total ignorance. But Moore's eyes were too sharp, too knowing. He'd already caught her in one deception. She'd claimed not to know about the safe until the last moment, when clearly she'd noticed it long ago. "I saw a hard drive," she said carefully. "And a folder with documents. That's all. I didn't read anything." "But you know what kind of documents Senator Winchester would hide in a secret safe, don't you? You've worked here 8 years. You've seen things." There it was. The real question. Not what had she seen yesterday, but what had she witnessed over nearly a decade of invisible service? What secrets had she absorbed while dusting shelves and folding laundry and standing silently in corners while powerful men made deals they didn't want recorded? "I clean houses, detective. I don't read my employer's private papers. Even when those papers might prove criminal activity." The question hung in the air like a blade. Moore was testing her, pushing to see if she'd break, if she'd reveal knowledge that could make her useful or dangerous. "What do you want from me?" Yanel asked bluntly. Moore studied her for a long moment, then closed the guest room door. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, Urgent. The men who robbed this house weren't random criminals. They worked for someone who wanted what Winchester was hiding. And now you're the only living witness who can place them at the scene, who can identify them. That makes you valuable. And in this situation, valuable people tend to become targets. I already figured that out, Yanel said, pulling out her phone and showing him the threatening text message. This morning. Moore's jaw tightened as he read. Why didn't you call this in immediately? Because I don't know who to trust. Your partner thinks I was involved. Senator Winchester wants me gone. And whoever sent this message knows where I live, knows my number, knows everything about me. Her voice cracked slightly. I'm just trying to survive this, detective. I didn't ask to be a hero. But you are one, Moore said quietly. Whether you asked for it or not. You saved Mrs. Winchester's life. And now you have information that could help us find these men and whatever they're working for. He paused. I need you to trust me, Ms. Morrison. I know you have no reason to, but I'm asking anyway. Yanel wanted to laugh at the absurdity. Trust a cop. She'd spent 43 years watching the police protect the powerful and prosecute the poor. She'd seen black men arrested for existing, black women dismissed when they reported crimes, entire communities treated as guilty until proven innocent. But Moore's eyes held something that looked like genuine concern. And she was drowning in threats and suspicion with no life raft in sight. What do you need from me? She asked again. I need you to tell me everything you know about Senator Winchester's business dealings. Every meeting you overheard, every name you remember, every detail that seemed wrong. Because I don't think yesterday's robbery was about money or campaign secrets. I think it was about covering up something much bigger. Before Yanel could respond, raised voices erupted from downstairs, Richard Winchester's distinctive boom and another voice she didn't recognize, sharp with authority. Moore's radio crackled. Detective Moore, we have a situation. FBI is on site. FBI. Yanel whispered. Moore was already moving toward the door. Stay here. Don't talk to anyone until I come back. He disappeared into the hallway, leaving Yanel alone with her racing thoughts. FBI meant federal crimes. FBI meant whatever was in that safe was bigger than business deals or campaign finance violations. FBI meant Yanel Morrison, poor black maid from nowhere, had stumbled into something that could destroy lives. She moved to the window overlooking the front driveway. 3 black SUVs had pulled up behind the patrol car. Men and women in dark suits emerged, flashing badges, moving with the coordinated precision of federal agents who meant business. And standing in the center of it all, his expensive suit immaculate despite the chaos, was a man Yanel recognized from the business news. Thomas Prescott, CEO of Prescott Industries. One of the wealthiest men in Connecticut. One of Senator Winchester's biggest donors. One of the names she'd heard whispered in Richard's study during late-night meetings she wasn't supposed to remember. Yanel's breath caught. The pieces were assembling into a picture she didn't want to see. Winchester had insurance on his business partners. Prescott was a major partner. The criminals had stolen that insurance. And now the FBI was here, which meant someone had reported a federal crime, or someone was trying to prevent the evidence from going public. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting another threat. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number with an attachment. Her finger hovered over the screen, every instinct screaming danger. But curiosity, and the desperate need to understand what she'd gotten herself into, made her click. The attachment loaded. A photograph. Blurry, taken from a distance, but clear enough to make Yanel's blood run cold. It showed the inside of Richard Winchester's safe. The hard drive she'd seen yesterday. And the top page of the documents, visible enough to read the header. Prescott Industries, offshore accounts, proof of federal tax evasion and illegal campaign contributions. Below the photo was a message, "You saw this yesterday. They know you saw it. The FBI can't protect you. Leave town tonight, or end up like the last person who knew too much." Yanel's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. The last person who knew too much. Who? A secretary? Another employee? Someone who'd already been silenced? Footsteps pounded up the stairs. Yanel shoved her phone in her pocket seconds before the guest room door burst open. Not more. FBI agents, 3 of them, with Richard Winchester and Thomas Prescott behind them. "That's her," Prescott said, pointing at Yanel with a manicured finger. The maid who let the criminals into the house. Arrest her. What? Yanel's voice came out as a gasp. I didn't. Ms. Morrison, the lead FBI agent said, his voice flat and official. You're being detained as a material witness and possible accomplice in the theft of federal evidence. You have the right to remain silent. I saved Mrs. Winchester. Yanel protested, even as another agent pulled her arms behind her back. I stopped them from hurting anyone. You also knew exactly where Senator Winchester kept his most sensitive documents, Prescott said smoothly. Documents that contained evidence of a federal investigation. Documents that are now in the hands of criminals. How convenient that you were here to help them find what they needed. The handcuffs clicked around Yanel's wrists, cold and unyielding. She looked past the agents to Richard Winchester, who stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral. No defense. No protection. She'd saved his wife, and now he was letting her be arrested to save himself. Senator Winchester, Yanel said, desperation creeping into her voice. Tell them. Tell them I didn't know about any federal investigation. Tell them I was just trying to protect your wife. Richard met her eyes for a brief moment, and in that look Yanel saw her entire life reflected back, the casual cruelty of powerful people who'd never face consequences, the disposability of workers who existed only to serve. He could save her with a single statement. Instead, he turned away. Take her to the federal building, the lead agent said. Mr. Prescott, Senator Winchester, we'll need your formal statements. They walked Yanel down the grand staircase she'd cleaned hundreds of times, through the foyer she'd polished until it gleamed, past the rooms where she'd worked herself to exhaustion for 8 years. Mrs. Henderson watched from the kitchen doorway, her expression unreadable. Carolyn Winchester was nowhere to be seen. Outside, reporters had gathered, cameras trained on every movement. They exploded into questions as Yanel was led toward a federal vehicle. Ms. Morrison, did you help the criminals? Were you paid to give them access? How does it feel to betray the family you worked for? Yanel kept her head up, even as tears burned behind her eyes, even as the handcuffs bit into her wrists. She'd spent her entire life being invisible, being silent, accepting her place at the bottom of a system designed to keep her there. But as she was pushed into the back of the FBI vehicle, as the door slammed shut and the cameras flashed and the reporters shouted, something inside her crystallized into diamond-hard clarity. She was done being silent. The FBI interrogation room was exactly like every cop show had taught her to expect. Gray walls, metal table, uncomfortable chairs, and a mirror that was obviously two-way glass. Yanel sat alone for what felt like hours, her hands finally free of handcuffs but her wrists still aching. She was thirsty, exhausted, and more frightened than she'd been facing down armed criminals. Because yesterday's criminals had wanted money and documents. Today's criminals, the ones in expensive suits who wrote laws and controlled fortunes, wanted something far more valuable, her silence. And they had the entire weight of the federal government behind them. The door finally opened. Detective Moore entered first, his expression grim. Behind him came a woman in her 50s, black, wearing a no-nonsense pantsuit and an FBI badge that identified her as Special Agent Regina Carter. Ms. Morrison, Agent Carter said, sitting across from her. You're in serious trouble. I know, Yanel said quietly. But not for the reasons they're telling you. Carter's eyebrow raised slightly. Then why don't you tell me what really happened? All of it. From the beginning. And Yanel realized this was her moment. Her one chance to transform from victim into witness, from scapegoat into truth-teller. She could stay silent, protect herself, take whatever plea deal they offered to make her disappear. Or she could speak. Really speak. Tell every truth she'd swallowed for 20 years. Name every name she'd heard in whispered conversations. Describe every meeting she'd witnessed while standing invisible in the corner, ignored because the powerful never imagined the help was paying attention. She thought about her daughter, studying nursing, trying to build an honest life. She thought about every other maid, every other janitor, every other invisible worker who'd been blamed for the crimes of their employers. She thought about the threatening text on her phone, about Thomas Prescott's smug certainty that he could frame a poor black woman and walk away clean. And she made her choice. I'll tell you everything, Yanel said, her voice steady despite her fear. But first, I need you to protect my daughter. And I need immunity. Because what I know about Senator Winchester and Thomas Prescott isn't just about a robbery. It's about years of fraud, bribery, and crimes I didn't even understand until yesterday. Agent Carter leaned forward, her eyes sharp with interest. You have proof? I have better than proof, Yanel said. I have 8 years of memories. Every conversation I overheard. Every name dropped in Richard Winchester's study. Every suspicious meeting with men who smelled like dirty money. You want to know who really organized yesterday's robbery? You want to know why those documents were worth killing for? She met Carter's gaze without flinching. I can tell you. All of it. But I need protection, I need immunity, and I need you to promise me that when this is over, I won't be the one destroyed. Moore and Carter exchanged a long look. Then Carter pulled out a recording device and set it on the table. Start talking, Ms. Morrison. And don't leave anything out. Yanel took a deep breath and began to speak. Every name. Every date. Every detail she'd absorbed while being invisible. The late-night meetings between Winchester and Prescott. The envelopes of cash she'd seen change hands. The phone calls about offshore accounts and shell companies. The threats made to business partners who didn't cooperate. She talked for 3 hours, her voice growing stronger with every revelation. She wasn't just telling the FBI about a robbery. She was dismantling an entire network of corruption that had operated for years in plain sight, protected by wealth and power and the certain knowledge that no one would believe the maid over senator. But Agent Carter believed her. And more importantly, Carter had been investigating Prescott Industries for months, building a case that needed exactly what Yanel could provide: insider knowledge, corroborating details, the kind of evidence that could only come from someone who'd been present but overlooked. When Yanel finally finished, her throat was raw and her hands were shaking again. But this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the overwhelming relief of finally, after 43 years of swallowing truth, being heard. Ms. Morrison, Carter said slowly, you just handed us the biggest political corruption case Connecticut has seen in decades. If everything you've told us checks out, and I believe it will, you're not just a witness. You're the key to taking down an entire criminal enterprise. Does that mean I'm not being charged? Yanel asked. You were never going to be charged, Moore said quietly. Prescott was trying to intimidate you into silence. He wanted you arrested to discredit your testimony before you could give it. But he made a mistake. He underestimated you. They all had. Richard Winchester. Thomas Prescott. Every person who'd ever looked at Yanel Morrison and seen nothing but the help. What happens now? Yanel asked. Now, Carter said with a smile that was almost predatory, we go get some warrants. And you, Ms. Morrison, are going into protective custody until we can guarantee your safety. You've made some powerful enemies today. I've had powerful enemies my whole life, Yanel said. At least now I'm fighting back. What would you risk to speak truth to power, knowing it could cost you everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below. 3 months later, Yanel Morrison stood outside the federal courthouse in Hartford, watching the last rays of November sun paint the granite steps gold. The air was sharp with approaching winter, but she barely felt the cold. She was too focused on the building behind her, where, just an hour ago, a jury had delivered verdicts that would reshape Connecticut politics for a generation. Thomas Prescott, guilty on 14 counts of tax evasion, bribery, and conspiracy. Richard Winchester III, guilty on 11 counts of corruption, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. And 5 other prominent businessmen and politicians, all brought down by the testimony of a woman they'd never bothered to see. The courthouse doors opened behind her, and Agent Carter emerged, followed by Detective Moore. Both wore expressions of satisfaction that came from closing a case that had consumed their lives for months. Ms. Morrison, Carter said, extending her hand. We couldn't have done this without you. You know that, right? Yanel shook her hand, still marveling at how strange it felt to be treated as an equal by people in power. I just told the truth. That's all I did. You did a hell of a lot more than that, Moore said. You stood up when it would have been easier, safer, to stay silent. You testified for 3 days under hostile cross-examination. You faced down death threats and character assassination. That's not just anything. The death threats had been the worst part. After Yanel's testimony went public, after the media realized the accomplice Maid was actually the star witness bringing down a corruption ring, the backlash had been vicious. Online trolls called her a liar, a traitor, worse things she tried not to read. Winchester supporters painted her as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. Prescott's lawyers tried to destroy her credibility by highlighting every mistake she'd ever made, every bill she'd paid late, every imperfection in her past. But the evidence had been overwhelming. Yanel's testimony, combined with the documents recovered from the criminals who'd robbed the Winchester estate, criminals who turned out to be hired by a business rival of Prescott's, ironically trying to steal the same evidence the FBI was seeking, painted an undeniable picture of systematic corruption. The hard drive had contained years of communications between Winchester and Prescott, detailing illegal campaign contributions, tax evasion schemes, and bribes to state officials. Yanel's testimony had provided the context, the human details that transformed dry financial records into a compelling narrative of how power operated when no one was watching. Except someone had been watching. The invisible maid who'd spent 8 years paying attention. "What will you do now?" Carter asked. "Have you thought about what comes next?" Yanel smiled, reaching into her purse to pull out a letter she'd received that morning. The logo at the top made her heart swell with pride. Hartford Community College. "My daughter graduates with her nursing degree in May," Yanel said. "And I'm starting classes in January. Criminal justice. Maybe social work. I figure if I spent 20 years watching how the system fails people like me, I should spend the next 20 helping change it." The FBI had offered her money, witness protection funds, relocation assistance. But Yanel had declined. She was done hiding, done making herself small. The trial had been covered extensively, her face broadcast across every news channel. There was no going back to invisibility now. Besides, she had other income now. The book deals alone, 3 publishers bidding for the rights to her story, would cover her tuition and then some. The speaking invitations from civil rights organizations, workers' rights groups, and universities wanted her to share her experience. The job offers from law firms specializing in employment discrimination, who recognized that her years of invisible observation had given her insights into workplace exploitation that most people never witnessed. Yanel Morrison, who'd spent 43 years being overlooked, was suddenly in demand. "You're going to do great," Moore said warmly. "And Ms. Morrison? For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Sorry that you had to face what you faced. Sorry that the system failed you for so long before it finally worked." "The system didn't work," Yanel corrected gently. "I worked. I made it work by refusing to stay silent. That's what people like me have always had to do, work twice as hard for half the recognition, then work even harder to be heard when we finally speak up." Carter nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. Which is why I hope you'll consider consulting with the FBI on other cases. We need people who understand how to see what powerful people try to hide. People who've spent their lives being invisible in rooms where crimes are committed." It was tempting. But Yanel had spent enough time in service to institutions. Now she wanted to serve her community, her daughter, herself. "I'll think about it," she said diplomatically. "But right now, I have somewhere to be." She said her goodbyes and walked down the courthouse steps, past the reporters who'd learned to respect her no-comment policy, past the supporters who'd gathered to cheer the verdicts. Her 15-year-old Honda Civic waited in the parking garage. She could afford a new car now, but this one had carried her through hard years, and she wasn't ready to abandon it just because her circumstances had changed. The drive to her daughter's apartment took 40 minutes through rush-hour traffic. Yanel used the time to breathe, to let the reality of the day settle into her bones. It was over. Really over. Winchester and Prescott were facing decades in prison. Their empires were collapsing under federal scrutiny. And Yanel was free, not just from the immediate danger, but from the weight of carrying secrets that weren't hers to bear. Keisha was waiting on her apartment steps, bouncing with nervous energy. At 21, she looked so much like Yanel had at that age. Same dark eyes, same determined set to her jaw, same refusal to let circumstances define her future. "Mom." Keisha rushed to meet her, pulling her into a fierce hug. "I watched the news. They're going to prison. All of them." "All of them," Yanel confirmed, hugging her daughter tight. "Are you okay? Really okay?" Yanel pulled back, studying Keisha's face. The face she'd worked 3 jobs to feed when Keisha was a baby. The face that had made every indignity and sacrifice worthwhile. "I'm better than okay, baby. I'm free." They went inside, where Keisha had prepared dinner. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and salad, but it was made with love and served in an apartment that Keisha paid for with her own part-time job. Pride swelled in Yanel's chest. Whatever else she'd done or failed to do in life, she'd raised a daughter who was strong, independent, and kind. Over dinner, they talked about the future. Keisha's upcoming finals. Yanel's spring semester classes. The book Yanel was considering writing. The speaking engagement at Yale Law School that terrified and excited her in equal measure. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Keisha said suddenly. "I know I said it before, but I need you to really hear it. You could have stayed quiet. You could have taken money to disappear. But you stood up and told the truth, even when it was dangerous. Even when people tried to destroy you. That's the most courageous thing I've ever seen." Tears pricked Yanel's eyes. "I did it for you. So you'd know that our voices matter. That people like us, black women, poor women, women who work jobs that others look down on, we have power. We've always had power. We just haven't always been allowed to use it." "Well, you used it," Keisha said fiercely. "You brought down a senator and a billionaire. You changed everything." Not everything, Yanel thought. There would be other Winchesters, other Prescotts. The system that enabled their corruption was still largely intact. But she'd struck a blow against it. She'd proven that invisibility could be weaponized, that the people the powerful overlooked were often the ones who saw the most clearly. After dinner, Yanel drove back to her own apartment. She'd be moving to a nicer place soon, but for now she was staying put, grounding herself in the life she'd built before everything changed. The studio felt cozy when she unlocked the door, full of memories and resilience. Her phone buzzed with a text message. She tensed instinctively, still programmed to fear unknown numbers after months of threats. But this message made her smile. It was from Carolyn Winchester. "Yanel, I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I wouldn't blame you if you never spoke to me again. But I needed you to know that I'm filing for divorce. I'm also donating my entire settlement to organizations that support domestic workers' rights. It's not enough. Nothing I do will ever be enough to make up for how I treated you. But I want to try. I want to be better. Thank you for saving my life. And thank you for opening my eyes. Carolyn." Yanel read the message twice, then set down her phone without responding. Maybe she'd answer eventually. Maybe she'd even forgive Carolyn, who was just another woman caught in a system that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. But tonight, forgiveness could wait. Tonight was for celebrating. She changed into comfortable clothes and settled onto her couch with a cup of tea, the good kind, expensive loose leaf she'd bought to celebrate the verdict. As she sipped, she thought about everything that had led to this moment. 20 years of invisible labor. 8 years of watching powerful people commit crimes they thought no one witnessed. 1 day of courage that had changed the trajectory of her entire life. She'd lost her job at the Winchester estate, obviously, but she'd gained something infinitely more valuable: her voice, her agency, her refusal to be defined by other people's perceptions. The poor black maid everyone looked down on had become the hero no one expected, not because she was extraordinary, but because she'd finally been given the chance to show what she'd always been: observant, intelligent, brave, and unwilling to let injustice go unchallenged. 6 months later, the community center in Hartford's North End was packed for Yanel's first public speech since the trial. She stood backstage, her palms sweaty despite months of preparation. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see the crowd: domestic workers, immigrants, students, activists, and ordinary people who'd followed her story and seen themselves reflected in her struggle. Agent Carter was in the third row, having become an unlikely friend during the months of testimony and depositions. Detective Moore sat beside her, both of them present to support the woman who'd cracked open their biggest case. And in the front row, beaming with pride, was Keisha. Next to her sat Yanel's sister, who'd raised Keisha during the years Yanel was working multiple jobs. Their relationship had been strained by time and circumstance, but they were rebuilding it now, 2 women who'd both sacrificed for family and were learning to lean on each other instead of bearing their burdens alone. "Ms. Morrison, you're on in 2 minutes, the organizer said, checking her headset. Yanel nodded, smoothing down the blazer she'd bought for occasions like this. Not designer. She wasn't interested in imitating the wealthy people who'd exploited her, but nice. Professional. Hers. She stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause. The lights were bright, the crowd was enormous, and for a moment Yanel felt the old instinct to make herself small, to apologize for taking up space. But she'd spent 6 months learning to take up space. Learning that her story mattered. Learning that the very invisibility that had once oppressed her had also given her a unique perspective on power and resistance. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying across the packed room. My name is Yanel Morrison. Some of you know me as the maid who testified against Senator Winchester. But I prefer to introduce myself differently. I'm a mother, a student, a survivor, and someone who learned that our work has dignity even when others refuse to see it. The crowd erupted in applause again. Yanel waited for silence, gathering her thoughts. For 20 years, I was invisible. I cleaned houses and offices and hotel rooms. I scrubbed toilets and folded laundry and served food to people who never bothered to learn my name. I was the help, 2 words that reduced my entire existence to a function. But invisibility taught me something crucial. When people think you're not watching, they reveal their true selves. They commit their crimes in plain sight. They speak their cruelties out loud. And they never imagine that the person they're ignoring might be paying attention. I was always paying attention. She told her story then, not the dramatic parts that had made headlines, but the quiet accumulation of indignities that defined working poverty. The back pain from jobs that destroyed bodies. The impossible choice between paying rent and buying medicine. The daily humiliation of being treated as less than human by people who'd never worked a day in their lives. I'm standing here today not because I'm special, Yanel said, but because I finally had the chance to speak, and people finally listened. But I want you to think about all the Yanel Morrisons who never get that chance. The domestic workers still being exploited in wealthy homes. The janitors and maintenance workers and service employees who keep our world running while being treated as invisible. What I learned from my experience is this: our work has value, our voices matter, and the system only changes when we refuse to stay silent. I was lucky. I had evidence. I had federal agents who believed me. I had circumstances that aligned to make my testimony powerful. But we can't rely on luck. We have to build systems that protect workers, that give voice to the voiceless, that recognize the humanity in every person regardless of their job title or paycheck. So I'm asking you tonight, who are you overlooking? Who cleans your office, your school, your hospital? Do you know their names? Do you see them? Because I promise you, they see everything. And they deserve to be seen in return. The speech lasted 30 minutes. Yanel talked about workers' rights, about the intersection of race and class and gender in employment, about the urgent need for stronger protections for domestic workers. She shared resources, named organizations doing crucial work, and challenged her audience to examine their own complicity in systems of exploitation. When she finished, the standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. People were crying. Yanel saw more than one person pull out their phone to donate to the organizations she'd mentioned. Afterward, during the reception, a steady stream of people approached her. Some wanted to share their own stories of workplace exploitation. Others wanted advice about speaking up against powerful employers. Many just wanted to say thank you, for representing them, for proving that ordinary people could challenge extraordinary power. An elderly Latina woman gripped Yanel's hand with surprising strength. I cleaned houses for 40 years, she said in accented English. Nobody ever treated me like you just talked about. You give me hope that things can change. They will change, Yanel promised. Because people like us are done staying quiet. As the evening wound down, Keisha appeared at Yanel's elbow, her eyes shining. Mom, there's someone who wants to meet you. She led Yanel to a corner where a young black woman in her early 20s waited nervously. She wore a cleaning service uniform, her name tag reading ASHA. Ms. Morrison, Aisha said, her voice trembling slightly. I work as a housekeeper at the Riverside Hotel. And last week, my supervisor, he touched me. Inappropriately. When I complained, they threatened to fire me. I'm a single mother, I can't afford to lose my job, but I can't keep working there either. Yanel's heart broke and blazed simultaneously. This was why she'd spoken up. Not for glory or book deals or news coverage, but for every Aisha who faced impossible choices between safety and survival. Have you documented what happened? Yanel asked. I wrote everything down. Dates, times, witnesses. Good. That's good. Yanel pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts. I'm going to connect you with a lawyer who specializes in workplace harassment. She works on contingency, so you won't need money upfront. And I'm going to make sure you have access to emergency funds if you need to leave that job while your case is being built. You don't have to choose between safety and survival, Aisha. Not anymore. Tears spilled down Aisha's cheeks. Why are you helping me? You don't even know me. Because someone should have helped me, Yanel said simply. And because we're done being invisible. 1 year later. Yanel Morrison's memoir, Invisible No More, A Maid's Journey from Silence to Justice, debuted at number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. The book tour had taken her across the country, where she spoke to packed audiences about workers' rights, systemic inequality, and the power of testimony. But her favorite events were the small ones: community centers in working-class neighborhoods, union halls full of service workers, college campuses where students were learning to see the people who cleaned their dorms and served their food. She'd finished her first year at Hartford Community College with a 4.0 GPA, balancing classwork with speaking engagements and advocacy work. The criminal justice program challenged her, forcing her to think critically about the same systems that had oppressed her for so long. But she loved it, loved learning, loved feeling her mind expand after years of being told she was only good for manual labor. Keisha had graduated with her nursing degree and immediately got a job at Hartford Hospital. Yanel had cried at her daughter's graduation, thinking about all the years of sacrifice that had led to this moment. Keisha in a cap and gown, walking across a stage, becoming the first person in their family to earn a college degree. Now Yanel was working toward becoming the second. The foundation she'd started, the Invisible Workers Fund, provided legal assistance, emergency financial support, and advocacy for domestic workers facing exploitation. It was small still, funded primarily by her book royalties and speaking fees, but it was making a difference. They'd helped 43 workers in the past year, people like Aisha who needed someone to believe them, to fight for them, to prove that their experiences mattered. Winchester and Prescott were both serving their sentences in federal prison. Their appeals had been denied. The corruption ring they'd led had been dismantled, though Yanel had no illusions that similar networks weren't operating elsewhere. Corruption was a weed that required constant vigilance to keep in check. But at least she'd pulled one weed by its roots. Carolyn Winchester had kept her word. The settlement from her divorce had funded scholarships for children of domestic workers, grants for organizations fighting workplace exploitation, and a wing at a community center in Hartford's North End that bore a plaque reading, "In recognition that the invisible work that sustains our society deserves dignity, respect, and justice." Yanel and Carolyn had met for coffee once, a stilted conversation between two women trying to find common ground across a canyon of past wrongs. They'd never be friends, too much history, too much harm, but they'd reached a kind of peace. Carolyn was doing the work of examining her privilege and trying to make amends. That was all Yanel could ask. On the first anniversary of the verdicts, Yanel stood once again outside the federal courthouse. But this time, she wasn't alone. 50 domestic workers stood with her, holding signs that read "Invisible No More" and "Our Work Has Dignity." They were there to support a new bill, the Domestic Workers Protection Act, that would extend labor protections to housekeepers, nannies, and home care workers. It was a small step, unlikely to pass in its first iteration, but the fight had to start somewhere. Agent Carter and Detective Moore had both showed up to lend their support. Even Judge Patricia Winters, who'd presided over the Winchester-Prescott trial, had written an op-ed supporting the legislation. The press was there too, cameras rolling as Yanel spoke about why this bill mattered. She was comfortable in front of cameras now, had learned to translate her experience into policy language that legislators couldn't ignore. 1 year ago, I testified against powerful men who thought they were above the law, Yanel said, her voice carrying across the courthouse steps. I was able to do that because I'd spent 8 years paying attention, seeing what they thought no one else would see. But I was lucky. I had evidence, I had federal agents who believed me, I had circumstances that aligned in my favor. Most domestic workers aren't that lucky. Most suffer in silence, afraid to speak up because they lack protections, because they can be fired without cause, because the system treats them as less than full employees. This bill would change that. It would extend basic labor rights, minimum wage protections, overtime pay, freedom from harassment, to workers who've been explicitly excluded from those protections for nearly a century. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for equal treatment. We're asking to be seen. The rally lasted an hour. Afterward, Yanel did interviews, answered questions, and shook hands with legislators who were cautiously supportive of the bill. It was exhausting work, this advocacy, but it fed something in her soul that 20 years of cleaning houses never had. As the crowd dispersed, a young reporter approached, barely out of journalism school, eager and nervous. "Ms. Morrison, do you ever regret speaking up? Your life would have been easier if you'd stayed silent." Yanel smiled, thinking about the question. Would her life have been easier? Maybe. She could still be cleaning the Winchester estate, invisible and exploited but employed. She wouldn't have faced death threats or character assassination. She wouldn't have spent months in protective custody or endured hostile cross-examination. But she also wouldn't have found her voice. She wouldn't have inspired change. She wouldn't have helped 43 workers escape exploitation. She wouldn't have raised a daughter who understood that courage meant speaking truth even when it was dangerous. Easier doesn't always mean better, Yanel said finally. I spent 43 years making my life easier by staying quiet, by accepting things I shouldn't have accepted. And you know what? I was miserable. I was invisible. I was dying a slow death of swallowed words and suppressed rage. Now my life is harder in some ways. I have responsibilities, expectations, people counting on me. But I'm alive in a way I never was before. I'm seen. I matter. And every day I wake up knowing that my voice might help someone else find theirs. So no, I don't regret it. Not for a second. The reporter scribbled notes, then looked up with admiration. You're a hero, Ms. Morrison. Yanel shook her head gently. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who finally stopped accepting invisibility as my fate. The real heroes are every domestic worker who shows up every day, who does the work that makes other people's lives possible, who maintains dignity in the face of exploitation. I just happened to have a moment where I could speak for all of us. That doesn't make me special, it makes me lucky. She said goodbye to the reporter and walked to her car, not the old Honda anymore, but a reliable used sedan that wouldn't break down on the highway. As she drove home through Hartford, she passed the familiar landmarks of her old life, the bus stop where she'd waited in winter cold, the grocery store where she'd bought discount food, the laundromat where she'd spent Sunday evenings washing clothes. She didn't live in that neighborhood anymore. She'd moved to a modest two-bedroom apartment closer to campus, but she drove through sometimes to remind herself where she came from. To stay grounded. To remember that she wasn't better than the people still struggling. She'd just been given an opportunity to rise. When she got home, a package was waiting on her doorstep. Inside was a framed photograph of her speaking at the courthouse rally, taken by a professional photographer who donated the image. Below it was an inscription. To Yanel Morrison, who proved that the people we overlook are often the ones who see most clearly. Thank you for refusing to stay invisible. The Invisible Workers Fund Board of Directors. Yanel hung the photograph in her living room, where it joined other mementos of her transformation, her college acceptance letter, a copy of her book's first review, a thank you card from Aisha whose harassment case had been settled in her favor, forcing the hotel to implement new worker protections. She made dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and salad, and ate while reviewing reading for her sociology of work class. The text discussed Marx's theory of alienation, how workers under capitalism become estranged from the products of their labor. Yanel underlined a passage, made notes in the margin, and thought about how academic theory connected to lived experience. For 43 years, she'd been alienated from her work, cleaning houses that weren't hers, serving people who didn't see her, creating value that was instantly made invisible. But now her work was her own. Every speech, every advocacy effort, every person she helped, that value was visible, meaningful, connected to who she was and what she believed. She'd finally found work that didn't alienate her from herself. Later, as she was preparing for bed, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Ms. Morrison. A woman's voice, young and scared. My name is Grace. I'm a nanny in Greenwich, and I heard you speak at Yale last month. And I need help. My employers, they're doing things that aren't legal, and they've threatened me if I tell anyone, but I can't stay silent anymore. Yanel sat on the edge of her bed, reaching for the notebook she kept by her nightstand. Tell me everything, Grace. Start from the beginning. And know that you're not alone. We're going to help you. As she listened to Grace's story, a familiar tale of exploitation, fear, and courage, Yanel felt the deep satisfaction of purpose. This was what she'd been meant to do. Not clean houses for people who'd never value her work. Not stay silent about injustice to preserve her own safety. But to speak. To listen. To help others find their voices. To prove, over and over again, that invisible people had always been the most powerful witnesses to how the world really worked. The poor black maid everyone looked down on had become the hero no one expected. But more importantly, she'd become the woman she'd always had the potential to be, if only someone had bothered to look closely enough to see her. And now, finally, everyone was looking. Yanel Morrison's story reminds us that courage isn't about being fearless, It's about acting despite our fear, speaking up when silence would be safer, and refusing to accept invisibility as our fate. Her journey from overlooked maid to powerful advocate shows that the people society underestimates, often the ones who see injustice most clearly and fight it most effectively. She proved that dignity isn't given by others. It's claimed by refusing to accept less than we deserve. That power doesn't require wealth or status. It requires the courage to use our voice. And that the most profound changes often begin with one person deciding they've been invisible long enough. Who in your life deserves to be seen? What injustice have you witnessed that requires your voice? Share your thoughts and commit to taking one action this week to support someone whose work makes your life possible but who rarely receives recognition. Drop your commitment in the comments below. Let's build a community of people who refuse to let anyone remain invisible. Thank you for experiencing this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it.